Hi everyone, this is Jason, producer of Data and Biotech. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know about our latest white paper. It's a comprehensive guide to implementing machine learning models in biotech manufacturing. It's a complete overview of all the potential problems of ML adoption and, more importantly, how to solve them. To download it, simply visit connect.cordine.com/biotech-ml. We've also dropped the link in the show notes of this episode. Okay, let's get into it. Welcome to Data in Biotech, a podcast from Cordine where we explore how companies leverage data to drive innovation in life sciences. Every 2 weeks, we sit down with an expert from the world of biotechnology to understand how they're using data science to solve technical challenges, streamline operations, and further innovation in their business. This week, we sat down with Jacob Oppenheim, entrepreneur in residence at Digitalis Ventures, a venture capital firm that invests in solutions to complex problems in human and animal health. During this interview, we discussed the importance of establishing strong data foundations in biotech companies and the limitations of existing tools in the industry. Why the current data tools and systems are more suited for coders and engineers, leaving scientists struggling to extract meaningful insights from the data. How the lack of modularity and integration between different tools and processes is a major challenge. And finally, why consultancies play an important role in providing expertise and guidance to biotech companies, helping them navigate the complexities of tooling and data management. Here we go.
Jacob Oppenheim, welcome to the Data and Biotech podcast.
Thanks for having me, Ross.
Awesome. Well, just to kick us off, can you give us a brief introduction to your career to date?
Yeah, so originally, like probably half or more of the people in data science and machine learning, I was some kind of physicist. I got a doctorate in biological physics, doing what I think today people would call machine learning to understand both how the brain processes sound and how the structure of blood vessels are orientated within entire organs. Of course, I managed to graduate with that PhD right in sort of the end of the AI winter and before deep learning became something people talked about. So I had no idea how to talk about what I was good at in the first place. I then spent about a decade building and running data science, machine learning, and software engineering teams in biotech. First company I jumped into, GNS Healthcare, I was designing novel machine learning algorithms to understand genomic data. And then I guess the arc of my career is really trying to get more and more at the basics. So I start at this machine learning focused consultancy, and I realized, hey, we don't actually have any data. It's just our clients' data here, and God knows what happens when our algorithms are applied to it. We never see any results back. So I was like, okay, I'll go join a biotech, right? And I'll start with the statistics of their data and see what we can do there. And so I joined Indigo Ag. I was there for 5 years. I built probably every data science team that Indigo ever had. So that started with just how do we analyze massive amounts of laboratory data? How do we analyze agricultural field trials, which is actually kind of funny as a statistics problem. That's how modern statistics was actually developed, was looking at fields of corn in England. That's what R.A. Fisher was doing. Anyway, so it was fun. I actually got to, go back to the basics in some ways. And then computational biology, bioinformatics, remote sensing, and image processing, a lot of interesting stuff there. But at the end of the day there, what was interesting is a lot of the things that mattered most were just about, could people use the data effectively? Could we store it effectively? And could someone who wasn't a data scientist actually put all the pieces together about, we were looking at microbes mostly to improve agricultural performance. Could somebody put all the data together and draw conclusions from it? And the answer to that was usually no, because the systems and tools to work with the data were not established from the beginning. So we're constantly behind in trying to build a strong foundation for data in this biotech company, right? And that was kind of uncomfortable. And so at some point I realized, okay, this has been great. I need to join a company even earlier so that we can establish the fundamental predicates of all of this from the beginning and establish the right culture and the right tools. I was at EQRX for 3 years, from not long after it was started until it wound down, really trying to use data to enhance the mission of EQRX. So the idea of EQRX was to lower drug prices by selling directly in volume to insurers, providers of healthcare, national healthcare systems. And so one way you can justify lower prices is make it up in volume. Another way is to be just much more efficient in everything you do. So there is a synergy between the management of EQRX and hiring me, because the idea was that we would build the right data platform for the beginning that would make everybody much more efficient in what we did. And so that meant starting even more at the grassroots, that sort of the base systems level, and building up from there. And that was really exciting, because one of the things I've always found is that the most interesting questions are the ones that come from building up from the beginning and are oftentimes surprising from the outset. When EQRX wound down about a year ago, I started looking for the next thing, and I've been thinking very deeply about what I had learned across my career so far. And so I made a jump into venture land. I'm an EIR at Digitalis Ventures. We're an early stage biotech fund based in mostly Boston and New York. And I am working on novel solutions for technology and biopharma.
So you're EIR, so entrepreneur in residence at Digitalis Ventures. Can you just talk to us a little bit about Digitalis and what its mission is and how you contribute to that mission in the role you're in now?
Yeah, so Digitalis has historically been an early stage biotech fund, actually half in human health and half in animal health. Very scientifically focused. And one of the things that attracted me to Digitalis is, honestly, their portfolio companies say they're one of the most involved investors and the investor they like the most. Frankly, I think if we're going to drive change in science and we're going to drive change in industry, we need to start at the earliest stages. So early stage funds, which have that collaborative relationship with their portfolio companies and who are deeply focused on the science, well, that's kind of who I want to be building technology with, right? And if I want to go start up a technology company for biopharma, I want to be working with people who have a good relationship with their portfolio. I want to be seeing the novel science, and I want to be thinking deeply about what's coming up and what are the tools, what are the primitives that are going to allow them to excel in the future.
Can you give us a few examples of like what that means in the context of biotech for a venture fund to be more deeply involved? So what are the kinds of capabilities or activities that Digitalis is doing that some other venture funds might not do in a similar circumstance?
Yeah, I mean, I think in early stage biopharma, there's a lot of questions about how do you take interesting science, be it from an academic co-founders or stuff that's right out of the lab, and prove it and turn it into something that's real, right? So how do you go about picking targets? I think that's the thing that our life sciences team spends the most time working with the portfolio on, is how do we pick targets, right? And then how do we prove out the technology, right? How do we get to the fundamental milestones that show that we can deliver on something? And sort of these translational aspects, I think, tend to be very scientific and ones where there's a lot of back and forth and working closely together, right? So I call it that scientific strategy overall as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And, sort of as entrepreneur in residence, it sounds like you get exposed to sort of the entire ecosystem of biotech startups and sort of the technological and scientific challenges that they're trying to solve, where the tooling ecosystem is sort of supporting them, where it's getting in the way. So, in the context of that perspective that you have, I'm just interested in what are the biggest challenges and opportunities that you see, especially data scientists and data teams, but the startups more broadly facing in the biotech ecosystem today?
Yeah, I think as anybody who's ever worked in a biopharma company knows, basically all the software that you're given is total crap. Has a horrible user experience. It looks like it came out of the Windows 95 or worse yet, the DOS era. It's not at all configured in such a way that things make sense or to encourage exploration, and it barely works for what you're doing in the first place. So I like to say we have these terrible tools and they kind of work for small molecule drug discovery. But a lot of us, what we're doing today is not small molecule drug discovery. And there we basically have no tools. And so you see this everywhere, right? People are discouraged when they're a small company without much money from investing in using digital tools in the first place for even tracking what they're doing or communicating more effectively within a company, because it's not really clear what the value of it is. And even if there is a value, it costs so much in terms of time, in terms of training, in terms of sheer cash to bring in tools, that you can't even make a logical distinction between, well, I'd like to save these data. I'd like to do this a little bit better. Let's bring in a tool here. That calculation almost cannot be made at this point, because the configuration, the training, et cetera, to use any such tools is beyond the scope of what somebody's doing, right? And so I've actually sat down with surprisingly large companies and tried to talk about, well, what are the tools that could be really valuable? What's like the lightest, simplest thing that you could put in because something's finally becoming enough of a pain point that it might be worth dealing with?
So it sounds like there's kind of this trade-off between investing in the tools and the platforms to develop, what you're doing, and, investing in the core science and, validating a scientific hypothesis early in these biotech companies. As a result of that trade-off where, there's not enough time, there's not enough resources, there's not enough talent to focus on both, you kind of have to choose one or the other.
I think people get forced into a trade-off where there shouldn't be one in the first place, but everything from the economics to the commitment required to use a lot of these tools makes it actually quite difficult, right? I'll give you an example that's somewhat further afield, but almost everybody with a lab has a LIMS system, Laboratory Information Management System. Okay, what is a LIMS? A LIMS is actually a machine or a set of software that's designed for doing things like tracking screws in a Ford factory, right? It wants to know about all the components that you have. It wants to track them. You scan them in and scan them out and follow your processes through. Almost nobody in biotech is at the scale where a system like that makes sense as a core operational driver. Should you have tools to track processes and what's actually happening in the lab? Absolutely. But they need to be pretty damn flexible because what you're going to do day to day is going to change as your science evolves, as your processes evolve, et cetera. So when the barrier to entry is bringing in a tool that feels like you're running a Ford factory, right, then it's very hard to make rational trade-offs there, right? It's very hard for you to say, I'm going to invest this much now, right? And so that also makes it difficult to bring a higher level of operational order into how people run a laboratory, how people industrialize and translate academic science into something that could be used for therapeutics development. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So when I'm hearing you talk, there's like kind of a bimodal distribution of the tooling ecosystem where you've got these very immature tools that are sort of developed in academic labs and don't scale very well, mostly on the analysis side. But then on sort of the data capture and preparation and data strategy side, you've got these really heavy tools that require a level of scale that most of the companies in the biotech ecosystem that you're exposed to currently they're not at the phase of the process where they need this level of tooling. And so getting people from sort of the beginning, from the data strategy at the beginning to like working their way up that maturity curve is sort of a challenge there.
Yeah, I think that's right to a very large extent. And these tools and systems, what's crazy is like having some kind of system to work with data to operationalize what you're doing in your laboratory. That should be one of the first things you need to do, right? You can always hand code an analysis, right? But setting up tools to manage data, to manage your compounds and register what all the molecules you're making and what batch they came in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is like fundamental, right? Because this is going to track you all the way through. If you need a laboratory notebook, right? This should be simple and easy for you to have all the tracking and some basic automation in there to make a scientist's life easier. But in most of these cases, these tools are big and heavy and expensive and feel ancient and archaic, right? I'll give you another analogy, right? I like to talk about how when you open up a computer, right, we're all use apps on our computer and on our phone from many, many different providers, right? And you open up a new Mac computer, right? There's this weird version of Microsoft Word. I forget what they even call the Word program. I think the spreadsheet is called Numbers. I don't know if anybody has ever opened these programs meaningfully in at least a decade. But Apple still occasionally thinks on this old design paradigm of I'm going to own everything you do on a computer, which I thought went away with the Microsoft antitrust suit in 2003 or whatever. But people in biopharma, the software in biopharma thinks that it's one app to rule it all. And so it's terrible at everything else except for one or two core features. This too adds to this expensive, slow to configure, hard to integrate, et cetera, pieces, making it really hard for scientists to just accelerate what they do with modern tools.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, over the past several years, it seems like there's been this explosion in, AI for biotech companies, and then a bunch of back-end, software as a service type applications that sort of on their face are meant. seems like are meant to solve some of the problems that we've just described. From an ecosystem perspective, what are these startups mainly getting right? And then what do you think they're, mainly getting wrong, like as an ecosystem?
So my perspective on this is that on some level, these tools are putting the cart before the horse. And I think some of these things can be very useful in specific use cases, right? But the key problem that we have is people don't have data stored and organized in the first place, right? And you say that we're going to go do AI and it's going to be valuable. Well, everybody's doing something different in biopharma for the most part. Their science is somewhat different. And in fact, the value that you have, your competitive moat in biopharma, is the data that you generate and your ability to operationalize it, right? And note that I'm not saying AI, data science, ML, anything there. It's the ability to store your data, do interesting science, and use that to inform the next science that you need to do, right? I'm writing myself out of a job here. So I think there's interesting applications where people have done interesting stuff, but I would be concerned that we're missing the fundamental value driver here. So let me give you an example. About 15 years ago, there was no fintech industry. And if you remember 15, 20 years ago, you still had to go to a physical bank to do nearly anything. And only if you had Charles Schwab or one or two other things could you even meaningfully bank online. You used to have to pay a lot of money to trade stocks, etc. It was crazy. Since then, finance has moved online. Finance has digitized and moved online in a way basically no other industry outside of tech has. The size of the fintech industry, which is basically didn't exist 15, 20 years ago, is $245 billion. $245 billion. That's insane. That is an industry that is entirely premised not on AI, not on machine learning really, but on moving numbers around, on capturing, storing, and moving data. Because that's fundamentally what's going on. Transaction processing, moving things from place to place, etc. And so what my pushback would be on some of this stuff is, okay, look at where digitization has happened, right? Is the value in finance in AI, in fintech AI, right? Or is the value actually building digital systems that allow this industry to move so much more efficiently and people to do so much better with what they're doing? And I'd argue that the value is very much in that space.
I'm wondering from your perspective, like if you were just designing that entire ecosystem from scratch, what would be the components of that process, and like what would it look like?
Yeah, no, I think this is a great question, right? Because right now we have pieces of an ecosystem, and every piece is trying to empire build and expand too much, right? But the problem is that we don't even have all the pieces that we need. We don't even have an integration layer. So it's kind of like saying that you're building Word and a spreadsheet program, Excel, whatever you want to call it, and PowerPoint, but you don't have Windows, right? You don't have an operating system. And so it's hard to even see how the pieces fit together, right? So I can look at categories in the market. I could say ELN, it's useful to have a record-keeping system, especially if it automates tasks for scientists. Like, why does ELN work in chemistry? Well, because it automatically calculates a bunch of parameters that you need to set up a reaction. Does your stoichiometry, does your weights, does a bunch of calculations on molecular structures for you. Okay, great. We need a piece. We need a piece to track everything in the laboratory and sign it in and out. We call it LIMS, but it should be lighter. We need a piece to register all the entities that we're going to be using that are potential therapeutics. That's our compound registry. Great. Are any of these things going to be interacting with each other? Maybe they'll touch each other slightly, but all these pieces are touching on data. But we don't even have a place to put data, to organize it, and to operate it with it at multiple levels. And that doesn't mean just dropping it in somewhere, but reporting on it and making it useful to people. So you can imagine that on top of that, you need tools around decision making, you need tools around project management, you need tools around collaboration. And people are touching at pieces of this ecosystem, but I'm not sure we even know what the entire ecosystem needs to look like in the long run.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it reminds me of, outside of the biotech industry, the way that sort of the quote unquote modern data stack has sort of tried to become that hub of that system by integrating the data in the data warehouse. But, the operating system that you're talking about is sort of a deeper level of integration.
Yeah, so I think part of the issue here is that we've got a bunch of great tech primitives that the tech industry has really developed over the past 10 years. And I think this is hard to see unless you're deep in software engineering and some applications on top of it, data engineering, et cetera. But the expansion of developer tools has really changed our ability to build things very rapidly. And so You bring people in, you're like, okay, well, we can build a data warehouse on Snowflake. We can use Fivetran to keep our databases in sync. We can put a front end on stuff. That's great. But those are primitives for people who are coders. They're not primitives for scientists. And so what happens is you drop data somewhere and it's still not useful because nobody can get the data out in a way that is meaningful to them. And the number of transformations that you need to do is not like what a software engineer would do. A software engineer, a data engineer, their problems are solved by DBT. And I love DBT. You just automate some SQL transforms in the cloud. Great. But what does a scientist need to do? They need to QC data. They need to analyze data. They need to aggregate it and create new views that are meaningful, right? Manager needs to see what everybody is doing and sort of create operational metrics on top of scientific data, right? That's a complicated calculation, right? And so we are missing some of the primitives that would allow us to take this software that's set for technology and make it into software that's fit for biopharma. Because if everybody needs to go in and custom build on top of Snowflake and Fivetran and DBT and AWS or GCP, et cetera, we can't do that, right? We don't have the money to do that. We don't have the time to do that. We don't have the energy to do that. It's crazy, right? We need better tools.
Like a tooling ecosystem that is meeting the biotech organization at their level of maturity, but leading them in the direction of the industrialization that they're going to take on later on. So it's trying to break that trade-off that we were describing earlier.
Exactly. And even if you had infinite resources, I just don't think a company needs to focus on their core IP. And that is never going to be building technological systems when you're there to build therapeutics, right? And to the extent that you build technology, it needs to be focused around what you're doing scientifically and the computational pieces of that, right? Or, suddenly you have some entirely new way to construct gene therapies or CRISPRs or something. Yeah, I'm sure you'll invent some data structures, but you shouldn't have to build everything from default off of a base database facility and the like.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, it just feels like, this is a recurring theme that I've heard from, people on the podcast and people who I'm talking to elsewhere, which is just the modularity of the processes and the tooling ecosystem. Like there's this lack of interfaces between them that allow you to sort of build the stack that your company needs without having to, roll your own entire ecosystem. Am I thinking about that right?
Yeah, you are. I love the term modularity here because nothing is modular right now and it drives me nuts because you should have modular components that work together well, right? That's how you build good software. That's how you make money in the tech industry, right? You don't create something that Empire builds and integrates with nothing. And it's a broken paradigm. And it's fundamentally science is too important for us to waste our time fighting with this sort of thing.
It's a really interesting problem because I think that practically everyone kind of agrees with the premise. Like the entire initiative around fair data is that, this ecosystem should evolve in this direction. So I'm just curious from your perspective, like, what do you think the barriers are? Why hasn't this come to be yet? And what do you think is needed to make that a reality? Is it just the development of that operating system, or is it something more?
Yeah, I think there's a bunch of changes that are happening in parallel that have allowed this moment to start to arise in a way that it probably wasn't. We weren't ready for it even 5 to 10 years ago. First thing is, it's just way easier to build this sort of software right now, right? You don't have to come in with perfect diagrams and everything. And in fact, if you go talk to people in biopharma who've been there for a while and understand data deeply, a lot of them will have beaten their heads on the difficulty of designing a database and designing data systems when 10 to 20 years ago, cloud storage barely existed. It was expensive. Compute was even more expensive. So every time you had to load data into a database or a data warehouse, you were doing transform beforehand and throwing away data. Now I can just throw everything on the cloud. I can build a bunch of different views. I can operationalize between them and keep them all in sync with DBT and tools like this. You just couldn't do that before. And even if you could set up a manual process to do it, it is very expensive to run all of it. So first thing is that we've been able to have systems that better capture the complexity and mutability of what we're doing in science. A second thing is that biology in the past 20 to 30 years has gone through a complete revolution in moving from a sort of basic science only to being an engineering science. And what do I mean by this? If you look at drug development, up through the 90s and early 2000s. A lot of it was phenotypic screens. A lot of it, as my friend who's a psychiatrist who's very involved in drug development says, it was, well, we noticed something weird in rats. Let's go add a bunch of methyl groups to it, right? And this is actually how most drugs in psychiatry were developed. And so this is not a way of doing science that is conducive to storing data, right? It's not meaningful to store data because fundamentally, even if you went and said, I want to drug this target, you would only be able to drug the targets that you could bind in the first place, which was a small fraction of them, that you had probes to test, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It was never a science of what should I do, but it was what science of what could I do. That kind of science is very hard to store data from and reuse it. Now, as biology becomes more engineering focused, we have the Human Genome Project. We have immense number of discoveries about RNA that happened in the 90s, right? We have an explosion in tools and technologies that allow us to modify fundamental underlying biology, create new cell lines, create better metal systems, et cetera. Now, if you have a target, it's not, can I hit this target? It's, well, should I use an antibody? Should I use some other type of biologic? Should I use a small molecule? Should I do a gene therapy? Should I do an RNAi? There's so many options, right? And because of the reusability of what we're doing and the components and the pieces of science that can be reused and we can decide exactly what we want to do, data is important, right? Data is reusable. I can design, I can go talk to biologists and design an assay cascade for a totally new therapeutic target to prove it out, right? And some of those assays I'm going to reuse again later because I understand the whole pathway and I understand what this assay is trying to measure. I'm not going to say that this is a perfect analogy and that these systems, we understand every detail of them, but we're enough at that engineering point where data is fundamentally reusable and data can guide what we're doing because it's so much more of a what should I do and how question rather than a what can I do other than pray.
In that environment where you're moving from the what could I do to what should I do arena, it strikes me that the problem space that you're exploring has the potential to be so much broader. And so that discipline of deciding what questions to ask, what hypotheses to test, what experiments to run, and then how to build on the research that you've done previously and how to organize it is just sort of a fundamental component of that environment. Am I thinking about that right?
Yeah, I would say that's right. And that totally changes how you think about anything computational on top of it as well, right? Instead of, I like to tell people that nobody really knows how to run a data science or machine learning team, especially in biopharma, right? It's just too new. And a lot of the paradigms people have tried are broken. Back in the day, you could say, well, we want to hire some data scientists. It's just going to be another branch of research science, and we'll see what people can do with data. Today, that's crazy. If you have data should be informing everything that you do. The data sciences team is not another team like the biology team or the chemistry team or the pharmacology team or the toxicology team. No, the data science team, their job is to analyze data and put it in front of people so that they can make better decisions, right? It's to productize the computational analyses that are meaningful, right? And sometimes that's going to be really complex ML, and sometimes that's just going to be show people the data. But that too has undergone a shift from being so much a researchy thing to this is a predicate for everything that we should be doing.
It also strikes me that this is why data science and biotech are sort of navigating these integration points, figuring out how scientists and data teams fit together and navigating the cultural clashes that come from that and sort of the differences in ways that they think about it, and navigating sort of the tooling conflicts about how each side wants to look at the world. So I'm just curious if you have sort of a vision for how that all shakes out. What does the biotech, let's call it a scale up of the future, look like, where they've got the right tooling, the right data management systems, the right organizational structure to sort of deliver on the promise of everything you're talking about?
Now, that's a tough question. No, but seriously, right, I think in the future, right, if we have software, if we have an operating system that allows people to use the data that's generated and make meaningful decisions, right, the point of a computational team then is to focus on core IP, right? It's to decide to work with the scientists, right, to understand what the key scientific questions are, and to bring computational expertise to answer them, and then to immediately publish that back out to everybody. I've found that teams work the best and organizations work the best where everybody knows who their customer is. And so the idea is that everybody in an organization, every team knows who its customer is, right? And is focused on delivering product to them. Biology team might be to run assays, right? The data science team is to expose data and meaning from data back to other people. The chemistry team might be to design and optimize molecules, et cetera. But if you know what your function is and who you're there to support, it allows you to industrialize processes and move much more efficiently and identify the gaps, right? And I've seen companies that do this well, right? Where they all are rowing together. And it's oftentimes a function of, what do I need to do? What do we need to serve? What is the goal here? What are we trying to get to, right? This isn't about resources or number of people or amount of time with the automation team. It's, what are we all trying to do here, right? And what are the critical steps that we need to solve here? Because science is always going to be hard. Even if we have an idea of what we should be doing, science is always going to be hard. So the faster that we can make better decisions and have that transparency, the more effective we're going to be.
But it reminds me of one of your blog posts where you were talking about how we're moving to a world where we're letting the requirements drive the decisions rather than the functions that we're onboarding drive the decisions about the data that we gather, the technology ecosystem that we're going to operate in, and that there's this data and technology strategy component, in particular in biotech, needs to be thought of at the very beginning in order to set the stage for the industrialization to happen later.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You should know what your requirements are. And that's what a functional group's job is, to come with requirements, right? To know what they need and to lay out what those requirements are. And maybe you don't know them perfectly, right? But you can sit down with technological experts. And then those experts can go out and find vendors. They can go prototype what software should look like and what computational tools should look like. And then they should come back to you and say what the answer, sketch out some possibilities. But this idea that we're coming as functional groups and knowing what the answer is for something outside of our domain is a very inefficient way to work. And it's no surprise that it oftentimes leads to terrible technology, poorly installed, unable to scale, et cetera.
Is that one of the roles that Digitalis is playing with the startup companies as well, as sort of helping them think through their tooling ecosystem? Or what are you seeing at the startup level? Is this more a problem of the more mature companies, or are the startups sort of that in the ecosystem kind of making some of the same mistakes and needing to be guided in the right direction in this regard?
I mean, I see this everywhere, right? The fact is that a startup company doesn't have enough time and energy to pick up necessarily what the right best practices are. I have a friend who used to run informatics at EQRX, and he got together with people who used to run IT, and they have an IT and informatics consultancy. And their whole point is, we'll set up your IT and we'll grow with you. And when you need a new informatics system, we're going to tell you how to license it. We're going to give you the best in breed options, and we're just going to set it up for you, because we'll be able to have that conversation. You're just not going to have the people who say, actually, these are the benefits and minuses of every compound registry system, or I need a chem design system. It's fundamentally going to be very difficult for a company, even at moderate to large stage, to do that, because then they need to spend their IT team going out and figuring stuff out and discussing things with the chemistry team and going back and forth about this, right? There's a need sort of for technical expertise and working with people as they grow to combine those pieces together. And some things, I think, say IT and informatics, is a classic thing that can actually be pretty successfully outsourced. And we have a lot of many years of experience seeing this being done well. So
yeah, that's interesting. So I mean, since you mentioned it, I'm just curious, how do you view the role of consultancies in the biotech space? And then is there an openness that you see at different tiers of the market to bringing in that external expertise, or is there sort of a fear of exposing your core IP and that sort of thing as part of that process?
So I think consultancies are super important. And the reason is that not everybody who founds a company or has a company is going to have the requisite experience on staff, or even know how to build out a team with the requisite experience, right? And you can see this all the time. If you're a biologist, right, and you do some sequencing-based assays, and there's some core facility and your academic lab in the university, et cetera, you may have a great idea about how to use some sequencing-based assays to accelerate what you're doing scientifically. So you go out, you raise some money, you stick to use the same spit and bubble gum pipeline you used in grad school, postdoc, et cetera, when you're a professor. And then suddenly you're like, well, it's time to run 10x as many samples and modify our assay to do X, Y, and Z. And then suddenly everything breaks and you have no idea how to fix it. There's a liquid market in biopharma, in sort of bioinformatic consultancies up here in Cambridge for exactly that reason. And that's great that they exist, because fundamentally, it's not even clear that those companies necessarily need to have a deep experience in translating the results off the sequencer. They just need a pipeline that can be set up and run, and somebody that they can call when it breaks, right? And I think that's actually quite important, because if we're going to succeed in engineering biology, it doesn't mean that everybody's going to do everything. It doesn't mean that every scientist is going to code, which is a lesson that it took me many years to learn. It means that we're going to all try to operate at the top of the stack, and we're going to bring in external expertise where useful. And so I do think that is actually quite important. And especially when you look at how biotech has virtualized the running of assays, people use CROs all the time. That's fundamentally not so different from calling a consultancy up to set up pipelines for bioinformatics and the like, or to help pick informatics systems and get them connected and working with everything you're doing.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that jumped out at me about what you said there. And I think it applies not just to startups, but to companies at, basically every level of maturity, which is that, you as a company need to focus your people that you bring in-house on the competitive advantage that you have as a company, what you're trying to accomplish and where your core IP is. And there's always trade-offs between the skills and the expertise that you in-house versus the skills and the expertise that you have available. And so there's always an opportunity to have a consultant like layer on top the expertise that you're missing and bring that expertise for a limited engagement, and then sort of like unplug so that you can, operate at scale more efficiently. What do you think about that idea?
I think that's exactly right. And, ideally help you figure out what the team needs to look like, and maybe even help you find the leader of it when you pass it off. I think that's actually quite important, because, look, to expand on a comment I made earlier, not every scientist needs to learn how to code, right? Even if you have some biologists in your lab who can do some Python or code in some R and the like, does that mean they know how to hire a bioinformatics or a comp bio specialist? I mean, it'd be crazy to think that, right? That's hard. And, if you're wondering why I say this, think about, if you are a computational scientist, do you know how to pick reagents in the lab? Do you know how to pick somebody who has good bench skills, right? Do you know how to pick somebody who knows how to design good biology experiments? I frankly don't. I don't think anybody does. And I think we're deluding ourselves if we think that we do know how to do this, right? And so what I want to see is pieces coming together and fitting in properly sized and properly scoped roles, because that's how we're going to be able to accelerate what we're doing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So a couple of questions as we wrap up. The first is, I know that you've done some pretty advanced machine learning in your time in the biotech space, and you've overseen teams that are doing the same. So I'm just curious, what are you most excited about in terms of the new data that's becoming available, or the new modeling capabilities that are becoming available, and how that helps to drive the industry forward?
Yeah, I got to say, the thing that I'm most jazzed about has always been imaging in biology. Sequencing is slow and expensive compared to imaging, even in imaging in numerous spectral bands all at once. I think there's basically relatively no limit on what you can do with imaging. We used to do a lot of hyperspectral imaging back at Indigo to try to understand plant health, and we would be imaging in the IR as well as the visible bands. You could see all sorts of crazy chemical signals pop out of that. Machine learning means you can start taking an immense amount of data and pulling signal out of it. You don't have to just start with the signal that you know about. Obviously, you need there to be signal that you can detect, and real signal, and you need something to be able to train off of. But I think one of the things I'm most excited about is just the ability to scale computational algorithms and then to work with, say, imaging data has been incredibly important. I'm a big fan of protein design as well. My opinion there may be, I think that we're much better at predicting off of sequence than we are to, go sequence to structure and then try to predict things off of the structure. I think we're in a much better place to do a number of interesting things directly from sequence alone. And continuing to further predict and refine structures is an artifact of the amount of data that we have about them, not the importance and meaning thereof.
Very interesting. And, since you're on the venture side as well, what advice would you have for scientists or entrepreneurs who are looking to start a biotech venture?
I think the thing that I've learned the most over the past year is that what you need to be clear about is what your science and what your computation, right? If you're computational, as I assume most of our listeners are, what does it enable in terms of figuring out biology and designing a therapeutic? I think those are the two steps that are missed the most. People come into something with, I can do this is interesting, but then they end up with just a whole bunch of data and no idea about how that necessarily informs picking a target and building a therapeutic against it. Or even if you have a better method for target selection and finding novel targets, right? You have to develop therapeutics off of that, and your entire platform you just built that tells you nothing about how to design those therapeutics. So the way I would point people is figure out what the implications, the deep implications of your science and your computation and your machine learning are. What does it tell you about biology, and how does that map into therapeutics design? And if you can figure that out, that's what we need, because right now, I don't think I see a lot of that, especially on the computation side. And that's going to limit the adoption and the overall efficacy of what we're doing in machine learning for bio.
Are there any resources you would point people toward in order to help connect those dots for them? Or is it just reading the academic papers in their domain and sort of coming up that learning curve the old-fashioned way?
I think talk to some drug developers. That's good. Unfortunately, I can't emphasize anything other than learning the old-fashioned way. I have to tell you, I love protein design, as I said. I think there's a lot of interesting questions about what we can do computationally on proteins. What are the rules that we're learning well, and what are the rules that we're not learning well? Because that's what we need to do if we're going to actually design therapeutics. But right now, that's a very hard question to answer. And it's frankly a question that's not really broached in the academic literature and even the translational literature. And that's a problem, right? I need to know, if I computationally design a sequence, am I going to get a bunch of alpha helices out? Am I just mimicking my training data? Where can I design? Where can I not? And that's going to fundamentally play into biology. And so, unfortunately, I think that means a lot of reading and a lot of chatting, but
that makes a lot of sense. But just curious if there are any other places where people can find you or Digitalis Ventures that you want to point people toward.
You can find me on Medium and on Digitalis' website. My blog is Engineering Biology, and on LinkedIn, I try to post a decent bit, but that's really where things end up.
Yeah.
And thanks for having me, Ross.
Yeah, Jacob, thanks for joining us today. It's been a pleasure, and we'll look forward to connecting down the line.
And that's it for this episode of Data in Biotech. If you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe, rate, or leave a review in your podcast platform of choice. See you next time.